Lakota Sioux. By the mid-1800s, the Lakota controlled the northern Great Plains, South Dakota, North Dakota, eastern Montana, eastern Wyoming, and western Nebraska, an empire defended by 7 allied bands, including the Oglala, the Hunkpapa, and the Minneconjou. Between 1866 and 1868, under Red Cloud, they became the only indigenous people to win a war against the United States outright, forcing the abandonment of 3 U.S. Army forts and the signing of the Treaty of Fort Laramie on Lakota terms. 8 years later, they inflicted the single most catastrophic defeat the U.S. Army suffered in the entire Indian Wars era. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 210 men of the 7th U.S. Cavalry into the valley of the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. He didn't know that 1,500 to 2,500 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors were waiting in the cottonwood groves, led by Crazy Horse of the Oglala and Gall of the Hunkpapa. The battle lasted roughly 1 hour. Custer and every man under his direct command were killed. However, the aftermath was worse than the battle. When a burial detail reached the field 2 days later, the bodies of the 7th Cavalry had been ritually mutilated. Soldiers' thighs had been cut open so they could not run in the afterlife. Ears had been cut off so they could not hear. Hearts had been removed. Eyes had been gouged out. Custer himself was not scalped. Accounts say Cheyenne women pierced his eardrums with sewing awls, punishment for a warning he'd ignored years before. His fingers had been cut off. An arrow had been driven into his groin. The victory triggered a U.S. military response that broke the Lakota inside 15 years. Crazy Horse was bayoneted to death at Fort Robinson, Nebraska on September 5, 1877. Sitting Bull was shot through the head by Indian police on December 15, 1890. 2 weeks later, on December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, massacred up to 300 Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek. Many of the dead were women and children frozen in the snow where they fell. Comanche. By the mid-1800s, roughly 30,000 Comanche controlled 250,000 square miles of the southern plains, an empire their neighbors called Comanchería, stretching from present-day Kansas into northern Mexico. They conducted mounted raids 800 miles into Mexican territory, striking haciendas, mining camps, and entire villages before melting back onto the plains. Military historian T.R. Fehrenbach described them as the finest light cavalry in the world. A Comanche warrior could fire 20 arrows in the time it took a U.S. cavalry trooper to reload a single-shot carbine once. He could hang from the side of a galloping horse and fire those arrows under its neck. Training began at age 5. Comanche raid doctrine stayed consistent for over a century. Warriors struck isolated homesteads at dawn, killed the men, took the women and children as captives, and burned everything behind them. Older captives who slowed the retreat were killed on the trail. Rachel Plummer, a 17-year-old settler captured at Fort Parker in 1836 while 6 months pregnant, later documented her captivity in a memoir. She watched Comanche warriors take her newborn son from her, tie a rope around his neck, and drag him behind a horse through cactus and mesquite until he was dead. She was beaten with rawhide, trampled by a horse, and sold 3 times before her father ransomed her back in 1838. On May 19, 1836, the same raid that took Rachel Plummer, a Comanche-led war party attacked Fort Parker in central Texas. They killed 5 settlers, mutilated the bodies, and carried off 5 captives. But there was another layer to the story. Among those captives was 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker. She would grow up Comanche, marry the war chief Peta Nocona, and give birth to Quanah Parker, the last free Comanche war chief. Here's where the empire ended. On September 28, 1874, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie and the 4th U.S. Cavalry descended into the Texas Panhandle Canyon of Palo Duro and attacked the last free Comanche bands in their winter camp. The warriors escaped on foot. Mackenzie's men slaughtered more than 1,000 Comanche horses in the canyon floor and burned every lodge, every buffalo robe, every food store. Without horses, the survivors drifted into Fort Sill over the following months. Quanah Parker formally surrendered on June 2, 1875. The tribe that had ruled 250,000 square miles and raided 2 nations for 150 years was reduced to a reservation in Indian Territory. Quanah, whose mother had been stolen as a child and whose people had scalped Texans for a century, spent his final decades negotiating cattle leases and leading a new peyote-based religion. He died of rheumatism at home on February 23, 1911. Apache. The Apache waged the longest sustained war against Europeans in North American history. Nearly 3 centuries, from Spanish contact in the 1500s to Geronimo's surrender in 1886. Multiple bands, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, Membreño, Lipan, spread across present-day Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, and Sonora. No tribe carried a more feared reputation among Mexican villagers and American settlers. Apache warfare was desert guerrilla warfare perfected across generations. Warriors could cover 70 miles in a single day on foot through terrain that killed cavalry horses. Their strongholds, the Chiricahua Base in the Dragoon Mountains, the Mescalero retreats in the Sacramento Mountains, were never successfully assaulted by U.S. forces. They struck by ambush and vanished before the counterattack formed. Apache captive torture was extensive and well documented by the Mexican colonial authorities who had spent 200 years trying to stop it. Victims were tied upside down over small fires and slowly roasted. Some were skinned alive, others were staked naked on anthills in the Sonoran sun. Here's where the cycle of violence accelerated. In January 1861, Lieutenant George Bascom falsely accused the Chiricahua chief Cochise of kidnapping a rancher's boy and tried to arrest him under a flag of truce. Cochise slashed his way out of the tent and escaped. In retaliation, he launched 12 years of continuous raiding that killed an estimated 5,000 settlers and soldiers across the Arizona Territory. But the Apache War didn't end with a battle. It ended with a train ride to Florida. Geronimo, a Chiricahua medicine man turned war leader, surrendered for the last time on September 4, 1886 at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. The U.S. Army loaded Geronimo and nearly 500 Chiricahua men, women, and children onto trains and shipped them to Florida as prisoners of war. Many died of tuberculosis in the humid heat. Geronimo himself died of pneumonia on February 17, 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, after falling off his horse trunk and lying in the cold overnight. He was 79 years old and still a prisoner of war. His last recorded words were, "I should never have surrendered." Mohawk. The Mohawk were the easternmost nation of the Iroquois Confederacy and the war arm of the most politically organized indigenous power in eastern North America. Their name, drawn from a Narragansett word, translates to man-eaters. Jesuit missionaries called them the Gate of the Iroquois Nation. They controlled the Mohawk Valley of present-day New York State and projected force as far north as Quebec and as far west as the Mississippi. Mohawk battlefield tactics, woodland ambush with tomahawks, wooden ball-head war clubs, and later muskets, were standard for the Northeast. What made them feared across the continent was not what happened on the battlefield. It was what happened to the captives afterward. Jesuit priest Isaac Jogues was captured by a Mohawk raiding party in 1642 and spent 13 months as a slave before escaping. His surviving letters describe what the French called the caressing, a multi-day torture ritual performed inside the longhouse. Captives were stripped, tied to a wooden platform, and systematically burned. Red-hot iron rods were driven into sensitive areas. Fingernails were torn out. Fingers were chewed off at the joint or sliced off with shells. Strips of flesh were cut away and eaten in front of the victim while he was still alive. The ordeal could last 3 days. If the captive screamed too early or showed weakness, he was dismembered and boiled in a communal pot. Here's where the Mohawk turned those tactics on their neighbors. In the 1640s, the Iroquois Confederacy, led by the Mohawk, launched the Beaver Wars, a campaign of annihilation to monopolize the fur trade. The Huron Confederacy, a nation of roughly 30,000 people, was destroyed in 2 years. Huron villages were burned, survivors tortured or forcibly absorbed into the Confederacy. The Erie, the Neutral, and the Petuns were all erased from the map within a decade. French observers estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Huron killed or carried into captivity. The Mohawk dominated the Northeast for another century. But the tribe that had erased entire nations with fire and torture was itself erased by a quill. After the American Revolution, in which the Mohawk had sided with the losing British, The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784 stripped them of their ancestral territory. War Chief Joseph Brant led the survivors north across the border into Canada, where their political confederacy endured, but their terror was finished. Seminole. The Seminole were a coalition of Creek refugees, Florida indigenous remnants, and escaped African American slaves. They are the only tribe in American history to never formally surrender to the United States government. They fought 3 separate wars against the U.S. military between 1817 and 1858. The Second Seminole War alone cost the United States roughly $40 million, equivalent to over $1 billion today, and the lives of approximately 1,500 American soldiers. It remains the longest and most expensive Indian war in U.S. history. Seminole warfare was swamp guerrilla warfare. Here's where they became invincible in their own terrain. Warriors used the Florida Everglades as a defensive environment no conventional force could occupy. Hammocks hidden inside miles of sawgrass, cypress swamps passable only to men who knew them from childhood. The tactic was the ambush. Seminole warriors would wait for a column of American soldiers to bog down in chest-deep water, open fire from concealed positions, and vanish before the counterattack could form. On December 28, 1835, a Seminole war party under the Chief McCanopy ambushed Major Francis Dade's column of 108 soldiers marching from Fort Brooke to Fort King. The warriors opened fire from point-blank range out of the palmetto. Within minutes, half of Dade's command was dead. The engagement continued until only 3 American soldiers remained alive, all badly wounded. Only one of them, Private Ransom Clark, survived to crawl back to Fort Brooke and report the massacre. The Seminoles lost 3 men. However, what no American army could take on the battlefield, they eventually took through deception. The war chief Osceola was seized under a flag of truce in October 1837 and died of malaria in a South Carolina prison cell on January 30th, 1838. He was 33 years old. The attending physician, Dr. Frederick Whedon, sawed off Osceola's head and kept it as a medical curiosity. Several hundred Seminole warriors retreated into the deepest Everglades and were never defeated. Their descendants, the Seminole tribe of Florida, have never signed a peace treaty with the United States. Aztec. The Aztec, known to themselves as the Mexica, were the dominant military power of the Western Hemisphere for nearly a century. Between 1428 and 1519, the Aztec Triple Alliance ruled central Mexico through an empire of 5 to 6 million subjects centered on the island capital of Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any in contemporary Europe. The Aztec military machine was the most sophisticated pre-Columbian war apparatus in the Americas. Professional warrior orders, the Eagle Knights and the Jaguar Knights, were drawn from the nobility and trained from childhood in combat, ritual, and endurance. Field armies routinely numbered 200,000 men, and conquered cities were not destroyed but taxed, required to supply captives for sacrifice. The Aztec signature weapon was the macuahuitl, a hardwood club edged along both sides with razor-sharp obsidian blades. Obsidian is sharper than surgical steel. The macuahuitl could amputate a limb in a single strike. Spanish conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo described a Mexica warrior using one during the Spanish retreat on La Noche Triste, June 30th, 1520, to decapitate a horse in a single swing, severing the head cleanly from the neck. But the Aztec did not primarily kill to conquer. They conquered to capture victims for sacrifice. Prisoners were marched up the steps of the Templo Mayor at the center of Tenochtitlan, held down across a curved stone altar by 4 priests, and their living hearts cut out with a ceremonial flint knife and offered to the sun god Huitzilopochtli. The body was then rolled down the temple steps. The heart, still beating, was placed in a stone bowl called a Cuauhxicalli. The dedication of the expanded Templo Mayor in 1487 under the Emperor Ahuitzotl was the largest single sacrifice event in Aztec history. Here's where the numbers become difficult to absorb. Aztec codices claim 80,400 captives were sacrificed across 4 consecutive days. Modern historians place the likely figure lower, perhaps 10,000 to 20,000. But Spanish sources who arrived in 1519 describe the Great Skull Rack of Tenochtitlan, the Huitzompantli, holding tens of thousands of human skulls. The rack was partially excavated by Mexican archaeologists beginning in 2015. It contained the skulls of men, women, and children. On August 13, 1521, after a 93-day siege, Hernán Cortés and his Tlaxcalan allies took Tenochtitlan. The final emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to flee by canoe. Cortés had the soles of Cuauhtémoc's feet burned with hot oil to force him to reveal where Aztec gold had been hidden. Cuauhtémoc refused to scream and refused to answer. He was hanged from a ceiba tree in present-day Chiapas on February 28, 1525. Smallpox, brought inland by one infected Spanish enslaved man in 1520, had already killed roughly 40% of the Valley of Mexico's population before the capital fell. The empire that had sacrificed tens of thousands to feed the sun was consumed in turn, not by superior armies, but by disease, steel, and the rage of the smaller nations it had spent a century feeding to its gods. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.